The first light of dawn slowly creeps over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pale orange and violet, casting an eerie stillness over the village. The air is heavy, thick with anticipation. The streets, usually bustling with the sounds of daily life, are almost unnervingly quiet. The usual rhythm of the morning is disrupted. Shops are shuttered, windows are drawn closed, and the once lively chatter of the villagers has been replaced by hushed whispers. There is no joy in the sunrise today, only a cold, apprehensive silence as the village braces itself for something it knows is coming but cannot fully understand. The night before, a rumor had spread, one so unsettling, it seemed almost impossible to believe. The British forces, who had long been seen as a distant hope for liberation, were finally within striking distance. But the news carried with it an even darker twist. They weren't coming to free the village. No, the whispers told of something far more sinister. The British, fresh from their successes on the battlefield, were intent on punishing the collaborators, the people who had worked with the Nazis during the occupation. The thought that some among them, ordinary villagers, might be among those who had sided with the enemy hung like a sword over their heads. The fear that gripped the villagers was not merely the fear of retribution from a foreign army, but the fear of facing their own actions, decisions made during a time when survival had been the ultimate goal. There were those among them who had cooperated with the occupying forces, either willingly or out of necessity, to keep their families alive, to avoid suspicion, to escape the wrath of the German soldiers who ruled over them. In a time when morality was often subjective and survival came at any cost, the lines between right and wrong had blurred, and no one was certain where they stood anymore. Now, with the war drawing to a close and the Allies closing in, the villagers faced a reckoning. In the streets, the tension was palpable. Groups huddled together, exchanging theories about what would happen next, their voices barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might bring down the wrath they feared. Some villagers had seen what had happened to others in neighboring towns, swift, brutal retribution carried out by the British forces, without mercy or hesitation. There were rumors of public executions, of traitors being hung in the town square, of families being torn apart by the force of justice that sought to wipe out all traces of collaboration. Some feared the soldiers would come in guns blazing, rounding up anyone with a known connection to the enemy, irrespective of their individual actions or motivations. The fear of collective guilt hung over everyone. The village had once been a peaceful place, nestled in the rolling hills of France, its history and charm woven into the fabric of the land. But in the last few years, it had become a place of surveillance, suspicion, and quiet dread. The villagers had been forced to live under the constant watch of the German soldiers, whose presence dictated every aspect of life. Most had learned to carry on in silence, hiding their true thoughts, suppressing their feelings, because speaking out could mean death. There were rumors that some of the villagers had worked with the Germans, some as informants, some as facilitators of supply lines, others simply as forced laborers, working under duress but still caught in the web of betrayal. No one had ever known for certain who could be trusted. It had been a long and brutal occupation. The Germans, with their cold, efficient cruelty, had taken what they wanted without remorse. They seized food, livestock, and supplies, stripping the village bare in the name of the war effort. Yet, despite the oppression, the villagers had found ways to survive. Some, too fearful to resist, had turned a blind eye to the suffering of others, convincing themselves that their own safety was worth the cost. Others, brimming with a quiet resistance, had fought back in small ways, secret sabotage, hidden messages to the Allies, or simply the act of preserving dignity in an otherwise degrading time. But now, as the war wound down, all of it was coming to a head. The village, once an anonymous place on a map, had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong during the occupation. It was a microcosm of a larger struggle, where the lines between right and wrong were no longer clear, and every action could be questioned. And with the Allies approaching, the time for reckoning had arrived. The older villagers, those who had lived through the First World War, spoke of a different kind of fear, the fear of being judged for actions taken in the heat of war. For them, survival was the greatest moral obligation, and the choices they made during the German occupation were a product of that necessity. Many had grown cynical, resigned to the idea that morality in wartime was a luxury few could afford. The younger villagers, those who had not experienced the horrors of the Great War, struggled to understand. They had grown up with stories of valor, of honor, and of the resistance. They had been taught about heroes, about those who had fought for justice, for freedom. Yet in their hearts, they too feared the punishment that might come for the choices made in the shadow of the German soldiers. The hours before the British arrived seemed to stretch on forever. The village, once filled with the noise of everyday life, had become a ghost town, with each person retreating into the safety of their own home. Yet there was no true safety to be found. No one knew who had been implicated in collaboration, or who might be judged guilty when the time came. Some villagers had already left, slipping away in the dead of night, hoping to escape before the Allies arrived. But for most, there was no escape. There was only the fear of the unknown, the fear of being exposed, and the fear of facing what they had done. The day seemed to drag on as the whispers continued to spread, more frantic now, growing louder and more urgent. The streets became less about the usual business of the village and more about collective anxiety. People stayed inside, peering through their windows, watching the horizon as if the arrival of the British soldiers could be seen from miles away. The once bustling village square was now empty, save for the occasional figure crossing quickly, head down, trying not to attract attention. And then, in the late morning, it came, an unmistakable sound, the rumble of military vehicles, the low hum of engines that signaled the arrival of the British forces. The villagers stiffened, and a collective shiver ran through them as they braced for the inevitable. The British were here, and with them, the promise of judgment. Some expected the worst, armed soldiers storming through the streets, rounding up anyone who had ever shown even the slightest trace of disloyalty. Others prayed for a miracle, hoping against hope that mercy might come instead of vengeance. The air was thick with dread, and the final moments before the British arrived felt like an eternity. The villagers could only wait, knowing that what happened next would shape the rest of their lives. Would they be judged by the same brutal standards that the Germans had once imposed? Or would they face something entirely different, something they could not yet comprehend, something far more complex and perhaps, in its own way, far more terrifying? As the vehicles drew closer, there was no turning back. Whatever was to come would be decided in the next few moments. The distant rumble of military vehicles grew louder, reverberating through the village as it cut through the anxious silence like a storm on the horizon. Every footstep, every sound of shifting weight in the streets, seemed amplified, as if the world itself had taken on a heightened sense of clarity in these final moments of waiting. The village, already brimming with fear and suspicion, was now completely gripped by the imminent arrival of the British forces. This was not a normal arrival. This was the end of an era, an end that was simultaneously a promise of liberation and a threat of judgment. For those villagers who still remembered the war years before the occupation, the arrival of any military force had once been a cause for celebration, for it signaled a potential end to tyranny, a return to some semblance of normalcy. But now, those same memories had twisted and soured, replaced by a gnawing fear of punishment. What had once been a mark of hope, liberation, had, over time, come to be viewed as something far more ambiguous. The thought of the British entering their village no longer conjured images of freedom and joy. It brought with it the specter of reckoning, the harsh reality that in war all lines were blurred and no one was truly innocent. In the hours leading up to this moment, the villagers had exchanged theories, half-hearted prayers, and trembling rumors. Some of the older residents clung to the belief that their actions during the occupation, however questionable, were justified by survival instincts. They had lived through the brutality of the First World War, had seen the crushing weight of the occupation firsthand, and had learned to adapt. In their eyes, survival wasn't just a matter of physical safety, it was a matter of moral compromise. If they had betrayed their fellow countrymen, it had been for reasons they could barely bring themselves to articulate: a few crumbs of food, a fleeting moment of protection for a child, or the desperate desire to remain unnoticed by the Nazi forces. These were not grand acts of collaboration but the quiet decisions made in dark corners of everyday life, when survival trumped ethics. Still, the sting of those decisions was undeniable. No one who had lived under the shadow of the Germans could pretend they had been free from guilt. Even if they had not taken up arms against their own people, many had been forced to carry out the smallest, most innocuous tasks that, in hindsight, might now seem like acts of complicity. The tension that gripped the village in the hours before the British arrival stemmed from that murky sense of guilt that was not easily defined or easily shaken off. For the younger villagers, those born after the war had ravaged Europe, the situation was even more confusing. They had grown up on stories of resistance fighters, of heroic acts of defiance against the occupying forces. They had been taught in school about the importance of loyalty and honor, and had idolized the men and women who had taken up arms, who had fought for freedom. But the reality of war, they were slowly beginning to understand, was far more complex than the tales they had heard as children. The stories of heroic resistance could not account for the difficult choices made by ordinary people, choices that had not been driven by ideology but by the overwhelming pressure of circumstances beyond their control. When the vehicles finally arrived, there was no immediate fanfare. The rumble of engines cut through the air like a blade, and the first British soldiers to enter the village were met with a tense silence, their boots crunching against the gravel of the streets, an almost mechanical rhythm that seemed to magnify the weight of what was happening. The soldiers, their uniforms sharp and disciplined, were an embodiment of authority, yet there was something different about them, something that set them apart from the German soldiers the villagers had grown accustomed to during the years of occupation. Whereas the Germans had come with an air of superiority, of forceful dominance, the British soldiers seemed almost hesitant, unsure of how to navigate the complex web of alliances and betrayals they would soon have to unravel. The commander, a tall man with dark eyes that carried the burden of countless battles, did not immediately approach the villagers. Instead, he surveyed the streets, taking in the scene before him with a mixture of wariness and weariness. His face was stern, a man who had seen too much, yet there was a flicker of something else in his gaze, something that suggested he was not simply here to extract vengeance. He had been briefed on the importance of this village, on the significance of its liberation, and on the potential dangers that lay hidden within its seemingly peaceful streets. But even he could not have known what awaited him. The villagers, having gathered in small groups along the edges of the streets, watched from behind shutters and doors. The fear was palpable in the air, their hearts racing as they watched the soldiers move through the streets. Some villagers still held onto the hope that their past actions would remain forgotten, that the British would see them only as victims of the occupation. Others, however, were ready to face the consequences, to accept whatever punishment came their way. The tension hung like a storm cloud, and every passing moment seemed to stretch on endlessly. As the soldiers entered the village square, the villagers began to feel the weight of history upon them. The square, once a place of laughter, of market days and festivals, now felt cold and unforgiving. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty, and every villager, young and old, felt as though they were being scrutinized by invisible eyes. The memory of the German soldiers' cruel rule still hung over them, and yet, the British were not the same. Their presence did not invoke terror, but something more unsettling, hope mixed with dread. The commander stepped forward then, his boots clicking sharply against the cobblestones. His voice was low, commanding, yet carried a weight that suggested experience beyond his years. The first words he spoke, however, were not accusations or threats. They were simple, almost mundane, but they carried with them the promise of something greater, something unexpected. The villagers had braced themselves for an announcement of punishment. Instead, the commander spoke of aid, of food and supplies, of rebuilding and of restoring what had been lost. His orders were not to search for traitors, not to round up collaborators, but to offer the villagers what they needed, help. The soldiers were there to restore order, not through retribution, but through compassion. The shock among the villagers was palpable. There was no immediate reaction. The words seemed to hang in the air, their meaning elusive, as if the villagers could not quite comprehend what had just been said. After years of being under the thumb of the Germans, after living in fear of their own neighbors, the villagers were now being offered mercy. It was as though the very foundation of their understanding of the world had been shaken. It was a reversal of everything they had expected, everything they had feared. Some of the villagers, still reeling from the shock, looked at one another in confusion, uncertain whether this was a trick, a ploy to lower their guard before the real punishment was handed down. Others felt a sense of relief, but the relief was tinged with guilt. Was it possible to accept this mercy, to stand side by side with the very soldiers they had feared, without acknowledging the darkness that had lurked in their own hearts during the years of occupation? But the commander's eyes, though stern, carried a depth of understanding that seemed to cut through the tension. There was no hint of anger in his words, no judgment in his gaze. He spoke not as a conqueror, but as a man who had witnessed the cruelty of war and understood the complexities of human nature. In that moment, the soldiers were not the enemy. They were the bearers of something greater, something that had eluded the villagers for years, a chance for redemption. As the commander's orders were passed down the line, the soldiers began to move through the village. They were not acting with the brutal efficiency that had marked the German occupation. Instead, they offered what they could: a warm meal, a blanket, a shoulder to lean on. And for the first time in years, the villagers felt something they had long forgotten: hope. But it was not an uncomplicated hope. It was one laced with guilt, with confusion, and with the lingering question of what it meant to be truly free. For the British soldiers had not come to deliver judgment, they had come to offer mercy. And in that mercy, the villagers found themselves faced with a new challenge: to reconcile the past they had lived with the future that was now unfolding before them. What would they do with this mercy? What would it mean for them to accept it? In the face of this unexpected gift, they found themselves grappling with the most difficult question of all: could they forgive themselves? The days that followed the British arrival were filled with a strange, unsettling stillness. The once anxious air that had settled over the village like a heavy fog began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of tentative hope. The villagers, still reeling from the shock of mercy rather than punishment, watched with a mixture of disbelief and cautious optimism as the British soldiers continued their mission. There was no crackdown, no arrests or executions, just the steady, methodical process of rebuilding. It was a far cry from what they had expected, and it forced the villagers to confront something they hadn't considered before: the possibility of redemption. It began quietly, in the ways that revolutions often do, not with speeches or grand gestures, but with small acts that accumulated over time. The soldiers distributed food to those who had gone hungry for months, and the village, which had been starving under German occupation, was finally given the sustenance they had long been denied. It was an almost surreal experience to receive not punishment, but aid, from the very people who had once been seen as the enemy. The villagers, still struggling to reconcile their fears with this unexpected kindness, found themselves slowly embracing the idea that perhaps they weren't as forgotten as they had feared. The first few days were spent in an uneasy silence. The British soldiers worked alongside the villagers, moving with a quiet efficiency as they repaired buildings, cleared debris, and offered supplies to families who had lost everything. Some villagers couldn't bring themselves to speak to the soldiers at all, too overwhelmed by the realization that this wasn't a moment of vengeance but of help, a concept so foreign after years of occupation. The quiet was punctuated by an occasional exchange, some awkward, some more natural, but every word, every gesture, was laden with the weight of the unspoken history that hung between them. For those who had worked with the Germans during the occupation, the presence of the British was a constant reminder of the choices they had made. The shadow of their actions loomed large, and many kept to themselves, their guilt now compounded by the kindness of their liberators. The mercy shown by the British forces felt like a mirror, reflecting the darkest corners of their souls. For the first time, they were forced to reckon with the reality of their complicity. Could they truly be forgiven for what they had done? Could they make amends for their choices? Or were they forever tainted by the stain of collaboration? The question gnawed at them, twisting inside as they watched the soldiers continue their work, offering a kindness they didn't deserve. But not everyone viewed the British presence through the lens of guilt and shame. Some villagers, particularly the younger generation who had been too young to make any significant decisions during the occupation, began to see the soldiers not as a reminder of their past sins, but as a symbol of hope. They saw the British not as a conqueror to fear, but as the very vehicle of liberation, the harbingers of a future free from the tyranny of the occupation. These villagers, eager for something to hold on to, began to speak more openly with the soldiers. They helped where they could, offering their assistance in the rebuilding effort. For some, it was an attempt to show gratitude. For others, it was an unconscious need to be part of something greater, something that offered a glimpse of a brighter future. As the days passed, the village began to transform. What had once been a place of silent despair, where the shadow of the Germans had stifled all expressions of hope, now hummed with a quiet energy. The soldiers worked tirelessly to restore order, repairing what had been broken, both physically and emotionally. Yet, amid this transformation, there was a constant undercurrent of discomfort. The villagers still didn't fully trust the mercy they had been given. The question of why they were being treated with kindness instead of retribution hung in the air, unanswered. It was as if they were waiting for the other shoe to drop, convinced that the mercy would come to an end, that the British would soon reveal their true purpose. The British commander, a man whose eyes seemed to carry the weight of countless battles, never wavered in his resolve. He was patient, understanding, and resolute in his mission to restore order without resorting to vengeance. Yet there was something about him that set him apart from the others. His calm demeanor, his refusal to engage in unnecessary brutality, spoke volumes. His soldiers, too, followed his lead. They did not bark orders. They did not raise their voices in anger or frustration. Instead, they worked beside the villagers with a quiet respect, understanding that their role was not to be the enforcers of justice, but the architects of a new future. It was a future, they believed, that could only be built on the foundations of forgiveness. Yet, as the soldiers' presence continued, some of the villagers began to question the commander's motives. Why were they being treated with such leniency when history had shown that collaboration was punished without mercy? Some murmured that the commander was trying to make a name for himself, that he was attempting to forge a reputation as a benevolent leader. Others speculated that he was simply biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. But as the days turned into weeks, these whispers began to lose their potency. The villagers, despite their suspicions, could not deny the tangible effects of the British presence. The children, once malnourished and sickly, were now playing in the streets again, their laughter ringing out, a sound that had long been silenced by the shadow of occupation. The adults, too, found solace in the work being done, in the small but significant steps toward recovery. It was in this quiet recovery that the villagers began to understand the true power of mercy. It was not about forgetting the past, nor was it about erasing the mistakes made during the years of occupation. Instead, it was about offering the possibility of a future, about creating space for growth and healing where once there had been only despair. The British soldiers were not asking for apologies. They were not demanding repayment for the wrongs committed. They were simply offering a chance to move forward, to rebuild what had been broken. And in that simple act of kindness, the villagers found themselves facing a profound moral reversal. They had expected punishment, but they were receiving compassion. And in that compassion, they found the seeds of redemption. Yet the presence of mercy also highlighted the divisions within the village. Those who had been complicit with the Germans were not the only ones struggling with their past actions. There were others who, having resisted in their own ways, were left to wonder, had they done enough? Had they fought hard enough against the occupation, or had they merely stood by while others took greater risks? The arrival of the British soldiers forced them to confront the uncomfortable reality that, in the end, survival had often been the most compelling force of all. The villagers who had resisted were not free from guilt either. Their resistance, while noble, had often been small-scale, scattered, and ineffective in the face of the overwhelming power of the Nazis. It was an awkward realization, one that left many feeling uncomfortably exposed. As the weeks turned into months, the village began to settle into a new rhythm, one that was still foreign but slowly becoming familiar. The British soldiers, though they had come to restore order, had inadvertently restored something more, a sense of dignity. The villagers, despite the weight of their past actions, began to understand that redemption wasn't something granted by others, but something they had to give to themselves. The commander's refusal to pass judgment on them, to hold their past mistakes against them, became a powerful catalyst for this shift. For the first time in years, the villagers had a chance to rebuild, not just their homes, but their lives, their relationships, and their sense of self. And yet, even as the villagers took their first tentative steps into this new future, they could not escape the question that lingered in the back of their minds. Could they truly forgive themselves for what they had done during the occupation? Would they ever be able to reconcile their past choices with the mercy they had been shown? The answer, for many, remained elusive. But one thing was clear: the road to redemption would not be an easy one. It would require more than just forgiveness from others. It would require the villagers to forgive themselves. And in that painful, transformative process, they would discover something even more valuable than mercy: the power of self-compassion. As the days wore on, a quiet transformation began to take place within the village, one that could not be seen immediately in the outward repairs of buildings or the distribution of food, but was felt in the hearts and minds of the villagers. The British soldiers, still present, continued their work with steady resolve. They rebuilt homes, cleared the debris of war, and offered their assistance wherever it was needed. The relief they had brought was undeniable. The villagers, once shackled by the weight of their own survival instincts, were now offered a chance to rebuild not only their lives but their own sense of purpose. It was as though, through the soldiers' mercy, the villagers were being given permission to hope again. But that sense of hope was not without its complexities. For many of the villagers, especially those who had cooperated with the Germans, the presence of the British soldiers was a constant reminder of their past mistakes. Mercy, after all, was not something that could be easily received when one's conscience was heavy with guilt. The lingering question that haunted the villagers was one that no one dared to voice aloud: do we deserve this mercy? It was a question that gnawed at the hearts of those who had compromised, who had betrayed their own people to ensure their own survival. For them, the kindness they were receiving now felt like a mockery of their past actions, as if they were unworthy of the very forgiveness they had been granted. Yet, despite the weight of their guilt, there was something profound about the British soldiers' refusal to pass judgment. The commander, in particular, seemed almost impervious to the moral complexity that surrounded them. His gaze was steady, his words carefully chosen, and his actions reflected a deeper understanding of human nature than most of the villagers had expected. His refusal to categorize people as good or bad, to label them as either collaborators or heroes, defied the binary thinking that had so often dominated the villagers' worldview. In his eyes, there was only one measure of a person: the potential for change. This recognition of human fallibility, paired with the offer of compassion, created a strange space for reflection. The villagers were no longer defined by their past mistakes but by their ability to grow, to heal, and to rebuild. In the quiet moments that followed the soldiers' arrival, the villagers began to question the very nature of guilt and redemption. Some had expected the British to come in with an iron fist, punishing those who had collaborated with the Germans, executing them in public squares to demonstrate their resolve. But that had not come to pass. Instead, they had been met with a gentleness they had not known in years, a stark contrast to the ruthless efficiency of their German occupiers. There was no payback here, no public shaming, and no immediate reckoning. What had been expected to be an act of vengeance turned into an act of restoration. The question that now haunted the minds of the villagers was whether mercy was something that could truly erase the sins of the past. For some, it was a difficult question to answer. The shame of their actions, even those taken out of self-preservation, was a burden that could not be easily shed. It was one thing to accept kindness, but it was another entirely to forgive oneself for the choices made in times of fear. The villagers, particularly those who had worked closely with the Germans, found themselves caught in a moral paradox. They had received mercy when they had expected punishment, and yet, in their hearts, they still felt like criminals. The villagers who had helped the enemy, who had betrayed their neighbors in order to survive, now found themselves wrestling with a new kind of enemy, the ghost of their own conscience. The elders of the village, those who had lived through both world wars, were particularly weighed down by the reality of their past actions. They had seen the devastation of the First War and had lived through the horrors of occupation during the Second. For them, survival had always been a delicate balance, one that often required morally ambiguous decisions. But even these hardened souls, who had long ago come to terms with the compromises they had made, could not escape the questions that now arose. What did it mean to survive, and at what cost? Was mercy truly a gift, or was it simply an extension of the same power that had once been wielded by the German occupiers? The presence of the British soldiers challenged the very framework by which they had navigated the world for so long. They were forced to confront the possibility that survival had not been the end of their moral obligation, that even in the harshest of circumstances, there were choices that transcended mere survival. But it wasn't just the collaborators who struggled with the concept of mercy. The resistance fighters, too, found themselves in an uncomfortable position. They had fought and often sacrificed for freedom, for the idea that their people could rise above the horrors of occupation. They had believed in the righteousness of their cause, in the power of resistance, and in the idea that they were fighting for a future where such compromises would no longer be necessary. And yet, the arrival of the British soldiers, with their compassion, seemed to render that fight ambiguous. The resistance fighters who had risked their lives to protect their village now found themselves questioning whether their sacrifices had been for something more than mere survival. Were they truly heroes, or had they simply been acting out of fear, just as those they had once condemned had? The British soldiers, for all their quiet kindness, were not unaware of the complex emotions swirling around them. They had been trained to liberate, to restore peace, but they had not been prepared for the emotional burden of mercy. They had expected to find enemies, to fight for freedom, to establish order after years of brutal occupation. What they had not anticipated was the internal struggle that came with the act of mercy. They saw the villagers, some ashamed, others resentful, and still others unsure of where they stood, and they understood that this would not be an easy process. Rebuilding a village was one thing. Rebuilding the soul of its people was something altogether different. But despite the internal turmoil, the soldiers continued with their mission. They worked tirelessly to clear the streets, to fix the damaged homes, and to provide food and supplies. They understood, perhaps more than the villagers themselves, that this act of kindness was not about erasing the past but about providing a path forward. It was about creating the space for people to reconcile their actions, to understand the choices they had made, and to rebuild, not just their homes, but their futures. The soldiers knew that redemption was not a one-time event, but a process that would take time. They had seen the damage that war had wrought on people's hearts, and they knew that the village, like the human soul, could not be restored overnight. As weeks passed, the villagers began to take tentative steps toward healing. Some who had been too ashamed to show their faces in public now began to venture out of their homes, cautiously engaging with the British soldiers, offering a smile, or even a word of thanks. The children, who had once been wary of strangers, began to play once again in the village square, their laughter ringing through the streets. The village, once silent and broken, was beginning to find its voice again. But it was not just the outward signs of healing that were evident, it was the quiet shifts in the hearts of the villagers. The weight of guilt began to lighten, and slowly, they began to embrace the idea that forgiveness, whether from others or from themselves, was not a one-time gift, but a slow and difficult journey. For many, the arrival of the British soldiers had marked the end of one chapter in their lives and the beginning of another. But it was not a simple transition. It was a messy, painful process of reconciling the past with the present, of forgiving oneself for mistakes made under duress, and of accepting that mercy, no matter how undeserved it might feel, was a powerful tool for transformation. The village, once divided by fear and guilt, was slowly being knit back together, not just through the physical act of rebuilding, but through the understanding that they had been given a second chance. And in that second chance, they had the possibility of a future that was not defined by their past, but by the choices they would make from this moment forward. The presence of the British soldiers, the mercy they had shown, had not been the end of the villagers' struggles. It had only been the beginning. The real work, the painful internal work of facing the past, of confronting guilt and shame, of accepting forgiveness and choosing to move forward, had only just begun. And as the soldiers continued their work, the villagers, too, began to rebuild, not just their homes, but their lives, their relationships, and their very sense of self. In that slow and painful process, They discovered that mercy was not just an act of kindness. It was the key to their own salvation. As the weeks unfolded, the village slowly began to shift from the tense and fragile state it had existed in since the arrival of the British soldiers. The change was not immediate or dramatic, but it was tangible, present in the way people began to look at each other and the way they interacted with their new liberators. The initial confusion had started to give way to a more subtle transformation. There were no grand moments of clarity, no sweeping speeches that suddenly made everything feel right. Instead, there was a quiet evolution, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniably present. The British soldiers continued their work with the same steadfast dedication they had shown since the beginning, and their presence, once so foreign and unsettling, began to feel almost ordinary. They were no longer seen as an occupying force, nor were they the distant figures of authority they had been at the outset. They had become part of the fabric of the village, working alongside the villagers as equals, not rulers. They did not demand gratitude or obedience, nor did they offer speeches about what they had done for the villagers. Their actions spoke louder than words. Food was distributed without fanfare, homes were rebuilt with efficiency and care, and the soldiers moved through the streets not with the air of conquerors, but with the quiet competence of men who had seen too much war and understood the weight of what had been lost.